Matt, welcome back to the program. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. How's it going, Tom?
Very good, thank you. I'm so pleased that you have a new book out, and I'm looking forward to reading it. Can you give us the summary of it, please?
Yeah, so it started off as sort of a rethink of manufacturing consent. I even went down to interview Noam Chomsky. That's in the introduction because I felt like I needed to have his blessing to do this project. But it's morphed into something that's more of a confessional about modern reporting techniques and how we're incentivized to sort of monetize divisions within society, and especially focusing on campaign journalism. So it's really about how campaign reporting is messed up and all the little deceptions in that world, and how it drives people to hate each other more than they probably would normally.
I went off on a rant yesterday about how news has changed. I started in the news business, a long time ago.
I think we both did.
Yeah. Well, in my case, it was in 1968. I got a job as a DJ in Lansing, Michigan, and in '71, I moved to news, and I did that until '76 or '78. And if we had a news block to fill, we had a series of news stories, and what we're seeing now is the panelization of news. It's the reality TV comes to news. And so instead of having, an hour to report and doing like BBC or France 24 does, where, in that hour there'll be literally 20 different stories with some, in-depth perspective. There'll be 3 or 4 stories for the hour, and each one of those stories will then provoke a 15-minute panel discussion with 3, quote, not even experts, 3 pundits. And it's super cheap to produce, right? And that's why they're doing it. But it's like we're being fed Hostess Twinkies instead of nutritious food with regard to news. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about, or have you identified something completely different that I'm missing?
No, definitely. I write about that a lot, and there were huge changes within the business that you talked about some of it. Some of it had to do with the launching of the 24-hour news cycle with CNN, and this incentivized people in the news business financially to drift towards, instead of doing what you were talking about, sort of individually packaged news reports that had some research behind them, suddenly news executives were looking more for stories that had a breaking or a visual element, and where you could just sit around and have a bunch of people discussing something as it happened.
Right.
And that was the cheapest way to eat up those oceans of time, but it also led to this sort of reality show element that you talk about. And one of the stories that lent itself in the worst way to that format was the campaign story, because it's 2 years of scheduled contests that you can essentially just talk about in the same way you do with sports radio. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the reasons why the political dialogue has been so degraded since a lot of these changes in the business.
Well, and one dimension of this is that in sports, basically you're not having a conversation about what the rules of the game should be, because they're set. They don't change from day to day. So it's basically, there's no discussion about legislation, essentially, about how the NFL should change its policies. It's a discussion about, how's this running back doing, or, how's that quarterback doing, or, did he injure himself this week, those kind of things. And in politics, we really need to have conversations about this candidate stands for this issue or this set of issues, and here are the consequences of these issues and how they will affect you, and here's how the rules could actually change as a consequence of this person getting elected. And we almost, and we used to, by the way, talk about politics that way. Like I said, I started news, what is that, almost 50 years ago. We used to talk about news that way. We don't anymore. Now it's all about personality. It is, as you say, as if it's sports. What do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a major problem because, again, this has to do with the financial aspect of it and the incentives. It's too difficult and sometimes off-putting to your target audiences if you get too deep into issues. So it's much simpler to simply cover it exactly the way we cover sports, which is to have a couple of teams and to talk about which team is going to win and which team isn't. And you invest heavily in all the gibberish that surrounds the contest and the horse race.
Right, the polling.
That's why you put the polling, the magic wall that John King has, all of the fanfare that goes with who's going to win, what's
right. It's the Super Bowl.
Saying today. It's the Super Bowl. It's Super Tuesday. We even use the same words. There's literally like a magic number for the delegates, which is the same as the magic number to clinch the pennant. We have the road to 270. We have all these things that completely borrow from the live variety format of sports programming, and again, it's just completely degraded the conversation.
So before I ask you how we fix this, one last quick question here, Matt Taibbi. Your new book, Hate Incorporated, or Hate Inc., where does the hate come into this?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened is that the TV and the entire news business really learned a lot from the experience of the crossfire format. When cable news in the 80s began to kind of sell the idea of political combat and
right.
the argument.
Gladiators,
right? And one of the underlying sort of concepts that animates that television show was that you could never have a resolution. The show doesn't work if people come to any kind of agreement or if they enlighten each other. It has to be ongoing, endless, relentless combat. And you even see ridiculous things like Paul Begala and Tucker Carlson being introduced with boxing gloves on before they do get out. And this sort of leaves people with the impression that they're rooting, not thinking,
right.
when they talk about politics. And I think that's spread to the entire business. And it began really with Fox News that kind of targeted one particular demographic and essentially turned into an ongoing pep rally for a certain kind of politics. But I think it's spread to the entire media landscape at this point. And we don't have that kind of meta conversation about politics for everybody anymore, right. And I think that's unfortunate.
So Matt, how do we? There's a few solutions, I suppose, that are relatively obvious. Reapplying the Sherman Antitrust Act to the media in the United States. Breaking up some of the big media, going back to ownership rules like we had before the Telecommunications Act of '96. This would atomize much of this, but that's not going to affect CNN. I mean, do you have any solution? Do you have solutions to this? Suggestions? Ideas?
Well, I mean, I think we have to go back a little bit to the public interest standard. I mean, the original Communications Act in 1934. Right. Essentially, it was a trade-off. What they said was you can lease the public airwaves, but in exchange, and you can make money doing entertainment and sports and all that other stuff. But news, you have to do something in the public interest, and it was always sort of understood tacitly, and I guess in your generation, maybe my father's generation, he was in the news as well, that the news could be a loss leader.
Oh, it was. It was.
Yeah.
When I worked at Whittle in Lansing, we had 5 or 6 people in the newsroom, and they absolutely lost money. And by the way, I would have lost my job if I had been caught talking, even just casually in the hallway, talking with any of the salespeople. There was an absolute firewall between sales and news.
Yeah, that's another major difference. I mean, you hear stories about the salespeople not even being allowed on the same floor as the editorial.
Yeah, no, I'm serious. Yeah. We avoided each other.
Yeah, and that's completely different. Now the salespeople more or less completely dictate the editorial.
They're suggesting stories. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. So you're saying that if we brought back the Fairness Doctrine, which did not say that if you have an hour of Thom Hartmann, you have to have an hour of Rush Limbaugh, instead what it said is if the station itself offers an editorial, they have to provide an identical amount of time for a rebuttal from the opposite side. And the station must program in the public interest, which was broadly understood not just to mean public service announcements, but also to mean a minute of the news or 5 minutes of news at the top of every hour. Just going back to that fundamental principle that Reagan blew up in '87 and that Obama finally took off the books 2 years ago. Is that your main suggestion?
I think that's one of them. I mean, I think another one is that news companies should. I think they have a lot of misconceptions about what does and doesn't sell.
Right.
In my own career, what I found is, there were, like, for instance, I covered the financial services industry a lot, and I continually heard from people, oh, you can't do complicated. Complicated doesn't work,
Yeah.
in modern media. But actually, if you don't talk down to audiences, they actually dig it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that major media companies have to understand, is that they have preconceptions about what's commercial and what isn't that are wrong.
Yeah.
And they need to test those more often.
That's a great point, and you can jazz it up a little bit by talking about giant squids.
Exactly.
Matt Taibbi, the great Matt Taibbi, contributing editor to Rolling Stone magazine, the author of 5 books. His latest is Hate Incorporated: How and Why the Press Makes Us Hate Each Other, or Hate One Another. Matt, thanks so much for dropping by today. Good luck with the book.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Take care.
Good talking with you. We'll be right